Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dana Swift, and good evening, and thank you all for tuning in. Books is an independently owned bookstore in Miami, Florida, and we're just so delighted to welcome you to this virtual evening with Justice Malala and Jonathan Ugg to discuss the new book, The Plot to Save South Africa, published by our friends at Simon & Schuster. And thank you for our authors, for a wonderful audience, and for being part of this. A little bit about our guests. Justice is one of South Africa's foremost political commentators and the author of the #1 best-selling We Have Now Begun Our Descent, How to Stop South Africa Losing Its Way, a longtime weekly columnist for The Times, South Africa. His work has also appeared in Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and Financial Times, among other outlets. And the former publisher of the Showtime and Sunday World, he now lives in Los Angeles. About our moderator, Jonathan is a best-selling author of Ali, a Life, which won a PEN Literary Award, as well as 5 other books. His new book, King, we were just talking about that, A Life, which will be released in May, has been hailed by the New York Times as a landmark biography and a monumental work that presents Martin Luther King Jr. as a complex human figure. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post any questions, and it's just below in that little box, Ask a Question feature. And then we will be answering them at the end after this discussion. And then please order your copy of The Plot to Save South Africa from Books and Books. Again, you can see that right there. The link is below, and help support independent bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest to the virtual stage.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for having us. And thanks to Books and Books, one of my favorite stores in the world. Justice and I have not spoken before today, although we have been longtime admirers. I have been a longtime admirer of his work. But I want to start by saying that this is my favorite book of the year. You can see how well I've marked it up. It's the kind of book that I love and the kind of book I aspire to write. It's filled with great reporting, beautiful writing. It moves like a novel, and it does not shy away from asking the hard questions and answering some of those hard questions. You know, Justice really offers the kind of analysis that some reporters, some writers shy away from in the pursuit of objectivity. But your willingness to confront these big issues and really, think about what these events mean and what we can learn from them really impressed me. So having said all that, Justice, I'm still really mad at you. I'm going to give you my Ali angry face. Do you know why I'm mad at you? We haven't talked about this yet.
No, please tell me.
Because there's a beautiful, beautiful Muhammad Ali scene in this book, several Muhammad Ali scenes, and I did not put them in my book. So I'm furious that I missed this unbelievably important chapter in not just Ali's life, but in South African history. And I've been thinking a lot about why I missed it. And it has to do with my own blind spots and my own ignorance about what was happening in South Africa at the time. I did not appreciate what was going on at the time of Ali's visit. Mm-hmm. So before we get to Ali, I want to ask you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself. You say in the preface to the book that you were born at a gold mine where your father was working, and that you were living in segregated housing, kicked out of that housing, moved several times, wound up living in a poor rural village in the north of South Africa. How did you end up being a reporter, and why did you want to be a reporter?
I like what you said. First of all, thank you to Books and Books, and thank you, Jonathan, for doing this with me. It's such a pleasure, such a joy to engage with you. But what you said about books that kind of have propulsion. One of the things that happened with being kicked out, the leaders of the apartheid government got into power in 1948 and immediately rushed off to the American South to learn about how segregation worked, how Jim Crow worked. Some of them had been already. Hendrik Verwoerd, who was the architect of apartheid, had been to the US, had studied very closely how Jim Crow segregation worked. So So when we were kicked out of the mining housing and ended up in this village in the north of South Africa, my father, who had gone up through the ranks by going to night school and so forth, had a thing that, no, all of you kids, because he had to leave on Monday morning at 3 a.m., go off to Johannesburg to work, and he'd come back late at night on Friday. And he had a thing that we all had to read that. So he'd arrive on the Friday with a bunch of newspapers from the week. And our job was to read them over the next week. When he arrived the next Friday, every Saturday morning I had to sit and tell him what I'd read in those newspapers. Now, it was quite boring for me. I was a kid. I was 8, 9 years old. I was just starting to read. And that's how I discovered crime thrillers, mysteries, which gave me another outlet. It was like, oh, these are fun, and the story starts, and there's a murder, and it's Justice and Jonathan, and they're going for it, and and you want to get to the end, and mystery solved. And I always felt throughout my childhood how, man, why is the history I'm taught in school so boring? Why are the newspapers so boring? And and I've always wanted to tell stories in that way that really grabs the imagination, that makes the young me want to read them. And so in writing this story, which is a sad, terrible, heartbreaking story in many ways, a story of assassination, of murder, of hate. I also wanted it to be a story that people would stay with. So in terms of just crafting it and putting it together, I yearned for that, to have an element of the fact that the stakes were high, and that there were good people who did amazing things to stop South Africa descending into war. So that's how essentially I ended up being a journalist, from reading those kind of, I read a lot of pulp fiction, I read a lot of westerns. I mean, you can imagine a young kid in rural South Africa reading Louis Lamar, all kinds of stuff. So I probably know more about cowboys than I do about Zulu warriors or something like that. It's yeah. So that was my reading as a kid, but that pushed me towards journalism. As a kid, I actually went to university. Initially, I got a scholarship to study engineering, and I segued into journalism, and that's what I've been doing for the past 30 years, and I'm kind of happy for it in many ways.
You and I share a lot of similarities in our backgrounds. We both started out as young reporters doing the grunt work. You think you call it the donkey work in your book. So tell us about being a donkey reporter on the night of April 10th, 1993, especially for people who haven't read the book yet.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened that morning that you showed up in the newsroom expecting not much to happen, and how that changed, not only your life, but changed history in South Africa. Give us a little bit of that story.
Yeah. So I just started I was actually hadn't really started in the newsroom. I was an intern. The newspaper group had a small school, as it were, and you sat there and learned about the 5 W's and the H, or the 5 H's and so forth. And you sat there and learned. I mean, we did something called shorthand, for example, and we did all the scribbling. So, in the US, Thanksgiving is a big holiday when people go off to fight with their uncles over turkey and so forth. and have big disagreements. In South Africa, the Easter weekend is that. It's a 4-day holiday. People leave on the Thursday afternoon, evening, and basically just get out of the cities. So the Star newspaper, which was the biggest upmarket daily at the time where I worked, most, if not all, of the senior journalists got out. They did what Nelson Mandela had done. Nelson Mandela had gone off to his rural home in the far southeast. The president of the country at the time, F.W. de Klerk, had done the same. He'd gone to his grandmother's farm in the desert, in the Karoo. So the power drained out of the cities and went out. No one expected anything to happen. The central figure in this story, a man called Chris Hani, who was Mandela's protege, his heir apparent, the most popular, the surveys at the time said the most popular leader in the ANC in South Africa after Nelson Mandela. He dismissed his 3 bodyguards and said, nothing is going to happen this weekend. No one is in Johannesburg. So you guys go off and do what you need to do. So that weekend, people like me were asked to come into the newsroom and essentially you call the police every hour on the hour and say, is anything happening? And they say, nothing's happening. You put the phone down, you wait another hour and you do it on the hour. That's what we did. So that morning I'd come over from my apartment. I sat there, I was having a cup of tea when the news editor of the Sunday Star, which was the Sunday version, it was a Saturday. It was my first day actually in the newsroom. The previous day I'd sort of come in and seen how it worked, and in fact I'd sort of covered what would be called a fair, an amusement fair, which is a big thing in South Africa, and no one wanted to print that story. Just 3 paragraphs of nothing. So, I sit there, I'm drinking my tea, when the news editor comes running to me and says, Justice, you got to get out to Don Park, which is a suburb of Boksburg in Johannesburg, and you've got to go, Chris Hani has been murdered. And that's when Chris Hani was a hero of so many South Africans. He was a freedom fighter. He was hugely popular, charismatic. People walked and traveled for kilometers, hundreds of kilometers, to listen to this man speak. And he'd been assassinated in his front yard, coming back from buying newspapers and coming home to read and spend the day with his daughter. He was shot 4 times in front of his 13-year-old child, who watched it all, screaming at the door. So that was my first day in a newsroom. So the news editor says, "Go off and do this," and 3 of my colleagues and I jump in a car and we head to Boksburg, and we arrived there, and some ANC leaders have arrived. Chris Hani is lying still on the ground. People are weeping and crying. We start taking notes, but the significance of the moment was not lost on anyone. It was one of those where someone tells you Chris Hani has been murdered, and you remember. It's a clarity that hits you that, oh my word, this is a turning point. For me, what was amazing was going back and interviewing some of the key players in this story. Everyone can remember. They can remember. I was driving. I was on the motorway. I was. There's an amazing, fantastic freedom fighter called Ronnie Casrels. He remembers he was playing football, and his wife gets the call, and she comes to. He's 50 years old at the time, and he's not so good at football, but he plays every Saturday morning without fail. It's in the neighborhood, and his wife comes running and shouting, Ronnie, come here. And he's not coming off. And she runs onto the field, and he looks around, sees his wife, and he thinks, I mean, can I have a moment by myself? And she says, you gotta get out, come, Chris Hani has been murdered. So it was such a big moment in South Africa. And within an hour of Chris Hani's murder being broadcast that this had happened, there were riots happening all over South Africa. People were very, very angry about what they were hearing. It was one of those for myself. Nelson Mandela wrote this in his biography. FW declared that this was the key turning point. South Africa was on the verge of possibly a civil war, because just the optics at the beginning that a white man had killed Chris Hani, that this was a racial murder, was enough of a match to set off what was already a volatile country.
So you do a great job in the book of creating that tension where, it moves almost, hour by hour, and we're there. We feel like we're there on the ground, and we're moving around the country and seeing these different scenes. But I'm wondering, at what point did you decide to revisit this story, and why? What did you hope to tell that hadn't been told before? Why was it important to revisit this now, 30 years later?
Well, it's two things. South Africa it's an amazing, we've been terribly blessed in South Africa by the leaders we've had. One of the things, there are lots of debates in South Africa, but one of them is about the place of Nelson Mandela in our history. Many young people are questioning what is the face of freedom? What is the meaning of freedom if young Black South Africans are bearing the brunt of the problems in South Africa today? So let me give you an example. I have a smile on my face in the US when unemployment, Biden is in trouble, or Trump is in trouble, or boasting about that unemployment is 4 or 5%. Among people age 18 to 35, unemployment is at 66% in South Africa. That is an extraordinary, scary number, that 2/3 of your young people are out on the street. They have no work. Prospects of them finding a job are slim, to say the least. And so you have this tension at the heart of the country today, far maybe as bad as it was in 1994 when we first voted, and so forth and so forth. But so the debates are about, was Nelson Mandela a great leader? What is the meaning of freedom? What is the face of it? And I wanted to write a book that reminded people of the extraordinary leadership of Nelson Mandela in that 1 week of this assassination, but also his leadership overall, and how in many instances it managed to shepherd South Africa through a very, very dark time to a democratic country that has its challenges, many, many challenges, as it has now. Also, I wanted to remind people that with the problems that we face, our problems are not in South Africa, and the problems of humanity, and whether it's the war in the Ukraine and so forth, a huge chunk of it is not, the Ukrainians are warmongers or the Russians are warmongers. It's leadership. Leadership really does matter. The people we choose to put in power matter. Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. And I want to make the point about F.W. de Klerk because in the book, he plays a fantastic part in the beginning, and then recedes and becomes, and he panics towards the end. But to show just how two opposing sides can find not a middle ground, but a place where you're not compromising on your principles, but you move ahead because this is the right thing to do, the necessary thing to do. You find that place. I think in a time of huge partisanship in the world, not just in South Africa or in the US, it's something to remind people, to remind ourselves that it's possible to do these things, that it's possible to achieve extraordinary gains for humanity in general. I think with great leadership, with empathetic leadership, with values, the kinds of values I'm sure you examine and talk about in your new book on Martin Luther King. So it's part of that. That was the impulse, but it was also about just my memories and South Africa's memories. We talk so much about Chris Hani because Chris Hani he was a hero. He was young, he was beautiful, he was charismatic. When he spoke, all of us listened, and he dies. So you have this ideal of the man, and then 30 years later, you look back and you say, oh, you see these guys and how they're running the country and so forth. If Chris was here, and it's always, if Chris was here, this wouldn't be happening. We'd be all happy and so forth. So I wanted to revisit those memories, revisit his memory and say, who was this man? How was this man? How, and talk a bit about that. And the story itself, there are so many things that we now have become legend. So it's, Justice Malala and Jonathan sat and had a lovely conversation when actually we had a fight. So there are huge chunks of national memory that are just plain wrong about Chris Hani, about Nelson Mandela, and about that week of Hani's assassination.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because you're going back and re-reporting a story that you reported 30 years ago, and I'm wondering what surprised you most. But I'm also wondering how history, as with in the case of Dr. King, we've whitewashed a lot of the story. We forget the rough edges. We forget we turn him into a saint, and when you do that, sometimes people begin to criticize him because suddenly he seems soft. He's King today is seen as somebody who was maybe too much of a compromiser for some people's tastes. And I wonder how Mandela's image has shifted and what you hope this book does to refine that image.
I'm a big believer in the humanity of the people that I love, that I have idolized. One of the things that I loved about your Muhammad Ali book was, as a kid in that rural village, the apartheid government, you couldn't say Nelson Mandela. If you did, you went to jail for 5 years. You couldn't say, there were names you couldn't mention. But at school, at primary school, at age 8, 9, what you call a pickup truck in the US would arrive and there'd be a movie projector. And that movie projector, they closed the school, 3 classrooms that opened up, and we'd watch a movie. And one of those things, before the actual big Tarzan or something stupid like, before it played, they'd show a 10-minute clip of Pelé, the Brazilian soccer player, or Muhammad Ali. Now, this would be, do you know what you're doing? Because it would be Muhammad Ali, fast-talking, beautiful, amazing, rumble in the jungle, and all of us would sit there and say, oh, wow, amazing. What the apartheid government didn't realize was that it was putting all these ideas in our heads. You this is the one guy you don't want to be exposing these kids to. But that was the hero Muhammad Ali that I grew up with. And what I find beautiful is when you write your book and you say, this is what it was. These were some of the pushes and pulls of this story, and it wasn't a straight line. Nelson Mandela is like that. People want Nelson Mandela to be the kind grandfatherly figure who walks out of prison and doesn't see race, for example, that he's the great reconciler, and he reached out to white South Africa, the oppressor, and said to black South Africa, you come along, and so forth. They don't see the militant Nelson Mandela, the radical Nelson Mandela, the Nelson Mandela who said, even with my militancy and my radicalism and so forth, there is a way, and there is a way in which we have to resolve this thing and get into democracy and start building a new country. So in that week, Nelson Mandela is a hero, and he gives an incredible speech 3 days after this shooting. But actually, there was 3 days in which he first gave a speech. So when I first said, I'm going to write this book, even I have to admit this, and Nelson Mandela's book, autobiography says this, and de Klerk and many other historians in South Africa, you'll find that they say Chris Hani is murdered in the morning. In the evening, Nelson Mandela gives a triumphant speech, which is amazing and incredible, and peace is restored. So in going into the story, I also said, I want to rewrite the story. I want to go back and do this and so forth and so forth. And it will be 24 hours, very tight, starts with the murder, ends with Mandela's speech and peace on earth. In fact, it doesn't happen that way. Mandela's speech that evening, despite everyone, not everyone, but most people in South Africa saying, oh, Mandela gave the speech of his life. Mandela's speech was delivered very late at night. People had gone to sleep. They didn't hear it. He couldn't see the auto cue properly, so he read it haltingly. He had problems from his time in prison with his eyes. And the speech, he didn't have participation in writing it. So it didn't have the Mandela touch to it. It was straightforward, let's not fight, peace, and so forth and so forth. But it was a very standard, very pro forma kind of invoice, no life to it. So in fact, that speech was a total dud. And Mandela was someone who said, you know what, that didn't work. I want to have another go at it. And that's when you see the Mandela who says, we're all human. I gave that speech. No one listened to it. No one remembers it. I'm going to give the great speech. And he gives this amazing, amazing speech, whose first 3 lines are just classic. And he says, a white man full of hate came to this country, killed our beloved son. A white woman saw the killer and called the police. And in that way, by juxtaposing the racial issue there, that these people want you and I to fight each other and say, oh, the white people are doing this and the black people are doing this. Don't fall for it. And that was the key moment in that week when he brought this hugely divided country together and said, bad people do bad things, good people do good things. And here you can see it. And that was the triumphant speech. But it was three days later, not on the evening of the assassination itself. So that's what I love. That's the rough edges that really make, for me, Nelson Mandela a huge hero of mine. That makes me actually admire and like him even more.
Yeah, I came away impressed not only with his oratorical skills, but with his strategic skills. He was clearly, leading from the conference room as well as from the pulpit, right? And I just want to say to our audience, please put in your questions. We're going to stop soon and take questions. So if you have questions, please put them into the comments section, and I'll turn to those in a minute. But talk about Mandela, the strategist, and why his vision and his ability to work across the aisles, as well as to calm the angry people. Why that was so important here. And you mentioned de Klerk earlier. You do a great job of really showing the subtlety of that relationship, and how there were not just good guys and bad guys here, that there was a lot of in between.
Yes. So I think the key thing about that, the 1993 event, was that Nelson Mandela had been released from prison in 1990. Negotiations had started in 1990, later on in the year. And they were going nowhere. By 1993, Mandela and de Klerk, the relationship started off very respectfully. Mandela said, and he was criticized for this, he said, de Klerk is a man of integrity. De Klerk said, this is a man I can do business with. It was all, now we'll get to a solution, to an agreement very quickly. It didn't work out that way at all. By year 3, thousands of people were dying every year in political violence, much of it inspired by the security forces, paid for by the security forces for agent provocateurs to push this violence, which led to the ANC walking out of the negotiations in 1992. Walkout before that in 1991. There were stops and starts. It was going nowhere. So Mandela strategically in that week also saw that, well, what do we do? One, we have an angry, hugely angry populace, people saying, we got to get this thing. Many in the ANC, not most, many in the ANC were saying, let's stop. But Mandela said, if we stop, then what? And he'd had lots and lots of talks about, if you stop negotiating, you've got to have something else you're going to do. Are you just going to sit? Are you going to go back to armed warfare against a very powerful apartheid government? Many people forget that the apartheid government was so powerful. It had nuclear arms. It was one of the world's few nuclear governments that possess nuclear capability. So Mandela said in that week, the key thing we need to get, not just for Black South Africans, not just for people who suffered hundreds of years of colonialism, for the whole country, we need an election date. And we need a way to get to an election that will be free and fair, run by an independent body. So those were the two things in that week that Mandela aimed for. He wanted to, the ANC and Mandela said very clearly, we need a date that we can say to people, yes, it's hard, yes, it's tough, yes, our leaders are being killed, but here we're going for it, and it's soon. And out of that week, the apartheid government agreed to the April 27, 1994 election date. It was announced just 6 weeks after Chris Hani was murdered. And they agreed to a transitional body that would oversee the elections a year later. So out of that terrible tragedy and the assassination of Chris Hani, there was a push and finally an agreement on those two. And that's why the world sees this these incredible pictures of Mandela and de Klerk holding hands, peaceful transfer of power from Mandela, from de Klerk to Mandela, and a new South Africa, a non-racial South Africa being born in 1994. But you can trace that date and that process to that week when Chris Hani was murdered, and Nelson Mandela stood his ground about those two issues.
One of the things that really struck me in reading your book was that King and Mandela had something in common, and not just Mandela, not just King, but all of the people who worked with them in this pursuit of justice. But they were not trying to overthrow an oppressive government. They were trying to gain access to it. They were trying to improve it. They were trying to make it live up to its promises of democracy. Mm-hmm. And that made them patriots. And it gave them a moral upper hand in a way, so that other people might look at them and say, they're doing this in a way that calls upon everything that we've been taught about what we supposedly believe in democracy and as people who believe in God. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you in the very closing pages of your book, you talk about another hero, and that's George Orwell, and what he teaches us about that kind of morality. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, thank you. You know, it's always been interesting in South Africa for me that I think what elevated and what elevates someone like Dr. Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela in large measure is because it's almost as if there is no opponent or enemy. It's that there is a humanity, there is a higher good that they're aiming for, that they want to carry the rest of us with on that journey. Nelson Mandela almost never regarded, you know, there were two moments in the 4 years of the transition, two public displays of anger towards F.W. de Klerk. But apart from those, it was almost as if F.W. de Klerk or the apartheid government did not exist per se. It was, here are the ideals to which we strive. Let's live up to them. And I think that's where the difference is. The passage you referred to was one of George Orwell's stories about this young policeman in colonial Burma, as it was, who is called, you know, is the only policeman, is the only guy with a gun in this village, and an elephant that's on mast is causing havoc in the village. Someone comes and says, you got to come and kill it. And interestingly, he gets out and suddenly there are people going, yeah, he's gonna kill the elephant. And everyone wants him to, by the time he gets to the elephant, there were 2,000 people, I think, behind him. And he's faced with this choice. He's got the gun. The elephant is no longer a danger to anyone, and it will not be a danger to anyone. Of course, it caused huge damage, but it's no longer. And everyone says, shoot. And the analogy I make is many of us in South Africa at the time, many people all over the world, to Dr. King, to others, similar leaders of that stature and of that ethical outlook, that do this because it will assuage my anger and my emotions. This young kid, this young policeman shoots the elephant. And I think it's that sort of moment. Nelson Mandela faced all these pressures, do this, and so forth. But he always said, but what are we about? We are about life. We're not about death. We didn't conduct the struggle against apartheid, against colonialism, against injustice to be revenge or for we didn't want to win. We wanted a better world, and that's what we'll go for. And I think it's why the King name, the Mandela name, are so powerful to me at a personal level. If I think about growing up under apartheid, there were always debates about, is Mandela, oh, Mandela is selling out, he's too soft, and. But I think striving for a better world is far better, far more fulfilling than striving for supremacy. And I think that's what's so different about these leaders, that they Nelson Mandela, for me, was as great for white South Africans who had oppressed black South Africans for a very long time as he was for black South Africans who sought freedom and achieved it in 1994. It was a triumph of humanity rather than a triumph of, oh, this side has won and so forth. I think that's the essence of it.
Yeah. And it's a moment that can still inspire us in these times when ethical leaders seem to be in short supply. We have just a couple minutes left, and there's a question from one of our viewers. How detailed is South African history taught in schools today? This person was born in South Africa as a white person and felt it was very one-sided. This person left in 1968 and now lives in New York. So do you have any thoughts on how these lessons are being taught today in South Africa?
Well, I think, South African history, sadly, has always been hugely contested. The history I was taught as a kid in school in the 80s in South Africa was pretty much the history of conquest, the history of history began in 1652 with the arrival of the first white settlement or establishment of a settlement in Cape Town, and it continued in pretty much that way. The fact that there were people living there and so forth was incidental. It wasn't recorded. It wasn't considered history. I think the South African government has failed to adequately transform the teaching. I don't think the quality of South African teaching has improved. South African schooling has improved as much as it could have. One of the biggest failures of the Mandela administration, in fact, in 1996-97 was that it needed to cut costs, and it went and shut down teacher training colleges, so specialist teaching colleges for teachers. And since then, we've struggled with curriculum design. Some things have changed, I'll acknowledge that, but not enough. But it's no longer seen. A huge chunk of what has changed is that it's no longer history from just one perspective. The history has always been complex. So the voices of colonized people, the voices of leaders who would never have been acknowledged are being acknowledged now. So I think it's widened a little bit, but I think the sadness for me is the quality of the teaching, the quality or the emphasis on inquiry, on asking questions. I don't think it's as pronounced as it should be. So that for me, the education system in general in South Africa has been poor since 1994. The changes that were expected to be made have not been made in as fast and as deep a manner as I personally would have liked. So South Africa's education system continues to lag behind those of its neighbors whether it's Zimbabwe or Botswana and so forth and so forth. So I think we haven't, as in many other instances, we haven't done as much as we could have to turn a great moment that was 1994 into a real reality. One of the key things is that when I talk about that 66% unemployment, the key part of it is that there isn't enough of an education. The education system is not meeting the needs of the moment, and that is a tragedy, to say the least.
Well, I hope that this book leads to a lot of interesting and important discussions in South Africa, as well as here in the States. And I will close we're out of time, unfortunately. Justice, I hope you and I get a chance to continue this conversation in person sometime soon. But please purchase this book from our friends at Books and Books in Miami, or at your favorite independent store near your home. Thank you for joining us tonight. This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you, Justice.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you both for being here. And thank you for our lovely audience.